Good evening, and thank you, Lee, for inviting me up here to Brisbane. I'm normally based in Sydney, and my main area of focus is in fact India. And I've just spent 2 weeks in India studying, talking, meeting with various people from industry to government to regulators to NGOs to the media on India's energy transformation. And I find that really fascinating. You'll probably, I'll deviate into that in a bit of detail, but the topic I grabbed hold of, Lee's given me already a little bit of a leeway there. I just looked at the opportunities and risks. That's what I look at. I'm not a carbon analyst, I'm an energy finance analyst. I talk to energy practitioners. I also don't focus too much on the by 2050 target. And part of that is because I want to look at what is being done today, and I want to look at what can be invested in today. And to me, transition in the energy markets is totally inevitable. It's going to happen. It's going to happen a lot faster than anyone predicts. I think I've been saying that now for 8 years, and every year it's happened faster than I thought. It's happened faster than anyone I've talked to thinks, and it's going to continue to happen. So to me, it's inevitable. Let's just get on and grab the opportunities and address the risks by transitioning our economy and our community and our workforce. So the opportunities are there. There are a multitude of them. As I mentioned, my main focus is India, but I also look at global finance, and so I'll draw that into this discussion as well. And part of why I'm doing that is because Australia is a huge exporter of fossil fuels, $120 billion this year, this last 12 months, of fossil fuels. So I think more than a decade ago, I said to my then chairman, look, Australia will never have an energy security problem. We've got more resources, whether it's wind, solar, hydro, coal, gas, whatever you like, even uranium. We've got more than anyone else in the world, and so we will never have an energy security problem. So I focus on China, Japan, Korea, and India, where energy security is absolutely paramount and influences every decision. You can wrap it up in climate change, or you can wrap it up in air pollution, or you can wrap it up in economics. But whatever the motives are, and it's all of those generally, or it's any combination of those, but energy security is always the foremost in any of those countries. Now, why is that relevant to Australia? Because it doesn't really matter what we do for the world. It's going to happen anyway because of what happens in Korea, Japan, China, and India. Now, we all care about Australia because we live here and we're worrying about the economy. We need to transition. It's going to happen because all of our customers are going to move, and they're moving faster than we're planning for. So we now have an energy security problem, which is a diabolical mess caused by a lack of planning. So anyway, there's a little bit of an intro, but my main focus, as I said, is India. I look at Japan, China, and Korea because they're major financiers of energy markets. And I do look at finance. My background, 30 years in finance, but the reason why finance and energy go hand in hand is that you see something like $2 trillion a year invested in the global energy system. So you can't spend $2 trillion without the finance community. A lot of energy assets are also very long dated. So again, money is the absolute driver. And if you think about a solar project, today a solar project is literally just money. There are no running costs. Once you build it, it just runs for 25 years and it's got a 90+% profit margin. So financial markets play a huge role in my view, and will play an increasing role. So maybe to start with something topical, negative if you like, but topical. Sorry, it's not all, this one's positive and negative. So we all know the markets, as Lee just said, are in meltdown. I just wanted to stand back and say, well, for calendar 2020, as of this afternoon, let's just compare Exxon, the red, down 40%. So biggest oil company in the Western world, down 40%. They destroyed $100 billion of value this year. The purple is the US market, so just a benchmark it. US market's down 10% year to date. Next year, energy is up, marginally up. Next year, energy is the biggest utility in America. It is the biggest investor in renewables in the world, by a mile. They spent $11 billion last year on energy, half of it on renewables, half of it on grid integration. They're the biggest investor in renewables in the world, and their shares are up this year. So when the FT and the Fin Review republished the FT article today saying, oh, the collapse in the oil price is really bad for renewables, I'd say that's crap. Right? Because the collapse in the oil price says fossil fuels are volatile. Now what is finance like? Risk mitigation, low volatility, certainty. Call it renewables, because there is no volatility. Oil is volatile. It's impossible to invest in oil if you don't know whether it's going to be 20 bucks or 100 bucks. So to me, oil is just reinforcing volatility. And so this will actually accelerate the transition. Anyway, that's just a hypothesis. It's the opposite of what the Fin Review ran today. The other one, Tesla, I've just thrown it in. I mean, it totally throws the chart, but Tesla year to date just up dramatically. Now again, Tesla's meant to get smashed because of low oil prices, because electric vehicles compete against oil. Do they? Not at all. So share market doesn't think they do. So anyway, just a little bit of context. Now, carnage in Australia, I just picked a few of my favourite fossil fuel companies, Whitehaven Coal, and I think this one, time frame, 1 year. So I just picked 1 year for this one. The other one was just year to date. So different time frame, just tells a different story. So Whitehaven down 60%. Purple is Woodside down 40%. Santos down 31%. And the All. So it's carnage in the fossil fuel sector. So standing back, global energy markets are in absolute transition, and it is happening faster than anyone expects. So let's put aside the carnage of last week and just stand back and look at technology and transformation, decarbonisation and capital flows. So the first point, I mainly focus on electricity markets. Thermal coal is used for powering electricity. Thermal coal competes against gas, it competes against wind, solar, hydro and nuclear. So I'm very much an electricity analyst, and I'm looking at the implications on thermal coal. So the International Energy Agency highlights that final investment decisions globally in coal-fired power plants collapsed 3 or 4 years ago. Now I use the word deliberately, collapsed. This isn't a 5% correction attempt. It's not as bad as the equity market down 15%. It's a 50, 60, 70, 80% collapse in only a couple of years. That's a pretty significant collapse for a globally important industry. And if you read the Australian press, the mainstream press, or you talk to Australian government officials at the federal level, coal's going to be here forever to come. There is no transition, and it's absolute crap. The IEA says globally, coal actually peaked 2014, 2015, and the financial markets are rapidly running to every other product. Now, it's not gone to zero yet, according to that chart, because that's the IEA's chart. If you actually looked at it from an IEEFA chart, we would say that in 2018, you take, 22 gigawatts of new coal plant developments in 2018, but coal plant closures were north of 20 gigawatts in 2018. So the net number is zero. It's down 100% in the last 3 or 4 years. That's a pretty dramatic change, 100% collapse. It's almost as bad as the collapse in GE's share price, the maker of thermal power turbines. The other one, which again you'll routinely hear about in Australia from our fossil fuel dominated government and industry lobbyists, is that Southeast Asia is going to require huge amounts of Australian thermal coal for decades and decades to come. Now, they just pivot the story to whatever PR spin they want. Now, 10 years ago, it was China was going to buy endless amounts more of Australian coal, and then China hit peak coal. So then India's going to buy all of our coal. No, India's not going to do it. They're already close to peak coal and they want to use their own coal. And by the way, renewables are 30% cheaper in India than domestic Indian coal. So that argument's out the door. So let's pivot to Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia's going to buy all of our coal. Doesn't matter. No one else is going to compete for Southeast Asia's market. Australia's going to have it to ourselves, which is obvious PR crap. So what I've thrown up there is an IEA chart saying that new coal-fired power plant pipeline in Southeast Asia has collapsed. Don't read about that from Whitehaven Coal, Australia's biggest listed coal company. You don't see that renewable energy last year took off in Asia. Now, Southeast Asia is an absolute laggard when it comes to renewable energy. They have been powering their economy and planning to power their economy for the next couple of decades using coal, using expensive imported dirty coal, using subsidised government financing. So that was their game plan. So it's all very well. Whitehaven talks the same talk about what the Southeast Asian countries have been talking, but I just have a look at Vietnam for a minute. Vietnam is the fastest growing large economy in Southeast Asia, and Vietnam increased its solar fleet tenfold last year. Tenfold. It only takes you a year to build a solar project. They built 4 gigs in 1 year, unexpectedly. This year they'll build 2 or 3 gigawatts of wind. So what does the Vietnamese government planning agency just announced this week? That they're halving their coal-fired power plant pipeline for the next decade. They've cut it by 15 gigawatts. Now, what's the entire coal-fired power plant fleet in Vietnam at the moment? 20 gigawatts. So this idea that coal is going to be a growth driver for the Australian economy for decades and decades to come as an export destination going into Asia, I'd point to Vietnam this year and look at what the Vietnamese government's saying. They want to build energy security. They don't want to rely on Australian coal. They have an air pollution problem. Funny that, so does India, so does China. Who's dealing with it? The Chinese are, so will the Vietnamese. One of the other reasons why I think this is just an inevitable transition is the massive ongoing deflation evident in renewables. And I've just picked 4 of the world's lowest cost renewable markets in the world. I've compared apples with apples, because if you're talking energy markets, if you talk different geographies and you compare one geography to another, you'll get a completely different answer. You're not comparing apples and apples. To me, these are apple and apple comparisons. So if you want to compare Portugal 6 months ago versus a year prior to that, price is down 10 to 15%. Los Angeles, California, power prices below $20 for solar, down 10, 15% on a previous year. Brazil, down again, $17 US a megawatt hour. Is there a coal-fired power plant anywhere in the world that can compete against solar at $17? Rhetoric question, obviously not. It won't even pay for the coal, let alone the workers, let alone the depreciation, let alone the interest. Qatar, lowest price in the world. Price is down 5 to 10% in the last year and sitting at what, below $16 US. So this trend has been going on for a decade. We're talking about solar today being 10, 20% of the price it was a decade ago. My forecast is it will continue to decline at 10% per annum for the next decade. Now, think of an industry that's had that sort of deflation. Think of mobile phones, think of fixed lines. Right? Think of your portable computers. It just transforms everything. Think of the internet. Right? It destroys the incumbent industry. And that's what's happening before our eyes. Now then you go, okay, but renewables, variable renewables, they're really intermittent. I mean, I'd respond using my Cannon Brooks. Well, it doesn't rain all the time, but we still have water 24/7, unless we haven't planned for a couple of decades. Oh, that's right, it's Australia. But batteries, dropping 20% per annum, 24% on Bloomberg New Energy Finance's numbers, 24% per annum for a decade in a row. It's probably going to keep dropping, maybe not at 24% per annum, but maybe it only drops 10 or 15% per annum. Now it's halves on a 3 to 5 year view. That'll change everything. So when you can then have batteries, you then have to totally transform the entire industry framework. And so whether it's batteries, whether it's a combination of technologies, batteries, pumped hydro storage, grid connectivity, interstate, international, whether it's demand response management, whether it's gas peakers, whether it's electric vehicles, all of them combined will solve the intermittency of variable renewables. It is solving the intermittency of variable renewables. It is decimating the coal industry every year or faster. Skip that one. 2019, just to remind you of a few numbers from literally the last 12 months, global electricity demand grew by 1%. It's the lowest rate of growth in a decade, and coal copped it in the neck globally. Okay, multitude of reasons. Bottom line, they lost to everything. That's not going to be unusual. That's going to be their story. I'll go back to a share price chart. My favourite utility in the world, NextEra Energy. This is a 5-year chart. So you can see it's just massively, NextEra Energy is the green, purple's the US stock market, and NextEra Energy has been massively outperforming the US market. And whether it's a 1 year, 1 month, 5 year, 10 year, 15 year time frame, NextEra has beaten the market every one of those. It's beaten every one of its peers. Why do I love NextEra so much? It's the #1 investor in renewables in the world, and it has been for 15 years. Now, I also like quoting NextEra Energy because it's not me, an independent think tank, biased, according to the media. It's the CEO of the most successful company in this area in the world. All right, so this is their view. So their view is that the US coal industry has gone from a 50% share in 2008, that's a statement of fact, to 25% last year, and the CEO of NextEra says that coal will go to 0 by 2030. Right? He's more aggressive than Greenpeace. He's more aggressive than any NGO that I talk to. Right? All the NGOs want us to go to 0. NextEra says it is inevitably going to happen. Now, NextEra also spends not a cent on coal. In fact, no investor in America spends a cent on coal-fired power plants. They maintain them. They are not building a single new coal-fired power plant. They're closing 10 to 15 gigawatts a year. So ultimately, it comes down to coal is a high marginal cost source of supply, and you're competing in an unfair fight. You're competing against wind and solar, which have a 0 marginal cost of supply. Economics 101 says you're going to lose it every time if you're the coal player. And what NextEra then goes to say very clearly is that once renewables have finished destroying coal, they will then destroy the existing nuclear power fleet of America. Destroy, like not talking a little bit of competition, we're talking destroy 2030 to 2040. Now NextEra has been one of the biggest owners of nuclear in the world, so they're not actually making ideological statements, they're just making a statement of what they believe to be the facts. So NextEra says that nuclear will be totally unviable come 2030, 2040, and even baseload gas will then get smashed next. Now that's where gas is the lowest cost source of supply in the world. So NextEra says gas can't compete against low-cost renewables in the lowest cost gas market in the world, but Australia is the biggest exporter of gas, so we bet our entire economy on the world taking really expensive Australian gas, making it more expensive by liquefying it and then transporting it up to Asia. But gas can't compete in America at the low point. Something not quite right. I think NextEra is right, and Australia's Gladstone Island, maybe we've spent $70, $80 billion of stranded assets. Maybe we've, as an economy, invested $80 billion in stranded assets. Now, I've been saying that for 5 or 7 years, and we've only written off about 1/10 of it so far. But after this week's move, last week's move, last month's move, there'll be another 10 or 20 billion written off this year. But NextEra's numbers back on the American domestic market. NextEra talks about their cost curve analysis. So they say that the power industry, near firm wind, near firm solar, that's their phrasing, that's their chart, will cost you $20, firm it up maybe $30. They talk about the cost of batteries being $4 to $9 US a megawatt hour, half what it is today. Now, NextEra Energy, totally hypocrites. They've only invested 10 megawatts of batteries 2 years ago, and they only invested in 12 megawatts of batteries last year. But you look at their forward forecast, they're going to build 600 megawatts of batteries next year and 600 megawatts the year after. So that isn't an incremental change. That's going from 12 megs to 600 megs. Logarithmic change, systemic change, total power sector disruption. That's NextEra's forecast. They're all public, it's all public information. The flip side of that, I've got the colour on, put green on Peabody Energy. Here's from Peabody, I assume. Peabody Energy down 78%. Now, The slide is just the last 2.5 years because People Energy, you're probably aware, went bankrupt in 2016. They recapitalised, they screwed their banks, they screwed their workers, they screwed the environment, recapitalised, Phoenix themselves, and now they're very, very rapidly approaching their second liquidation. Europe's my centre of the world, my centre of my analysis is all about Japan, China and India. It's an Asian century. But Europe, we shouldn't ignore, A, they've invested for 20 years in the right technology. B, they've finally got a price signal on carbon and it's driving systemic change in Europe. Heavy industry accepts that the price on carbon is here to stay, that it's gone up, and they are incorporating into their cost of doing business. Now, if a country like Australia wants to continue being a global laggard, just doing what we're doing, then Europe's talking carbon border taxes. So they're not just going to cop it and lose their industry, they'll just put a border tax on. They're working out how they can do that within the WTO framework, and they can. The WTO is not about allowing countries like Australia to be global laggards, it's about actually a fair playing field. So to me, Europe's got a price signal, it's working, and it's decarbonising their industry, and their industry is solving the problems. China, world's biggest market, world's biggest electricity market, by far the world's biggest coal producer, consumer and importer. They've been a laggard in terms of getting their costs down. They've been subsidising their renewables, and because they were subsidising it, the industry was very happy to build 30, 40, 50 gigs of solar a year. A year ago, I think 18 months ago, the Chinese government woke up and realised that their cost of solar was more than double the cost of solar in India. Who's building the solar modules? China. They're exporting them to India, and India's installing them at a tariff less than half of what China was doing. So China woke up one day, said we're canning solar installs until we drive the price down. So what did the price do? It dropped by 50% overnight. So they're at grid parity as of this year for solar. They originally 10 years ago said they get to grid parity by 2023. The Chinese are a command economy, and when they move very aggressively and they do it in a disruptive way, but renewables are now at grid parity, or effectively will be by the end of this year for wind and solar. They're the world's biggest investor in them, they're the biggest investor domestically but also internationally. One of the big bugbears, the second chart I've thrown up, China has been investing globally up until the last 2 years very aggressively in a technology agnostic way, or in fact in a very counterintuitive way. They've been investing massively in fossil fuel developments out of China. And so we're trying to work out why, we're trying to work out how we combat that, but also understanding why they were doing it. And it's all about exporting redundant capacity from their own domestic economy. So when you look at the 5 big Chinese state-owned enterprises, they will stop building new coal-fired power plants, so they've exported that capacity under the term BRI, the Belt Road Initiative. So global dominance from China, exporting a lot of LNG and coal capacity. So they're also providing all the financing for it. Now, part of what IEEFA does is works in the finance area, and I'll come to that about the Western world. There's really good momentum, but what we were coming up against was, well, hang on, the Chinese, the Japanese and the Koreans are the biggest funders of coal in the world for the last 3 to 5 years. You can move China, you can move Japan and Korea, well, you can try, and that's what we've been working on. It's impossible to move the Chinese. Like, we can't operate in China. You can't target them, you can't do the civil disobedience, you can't moral suasion. They're going to do it for their own self-interest. But for various reasons, I look at this chart. So this is a Boston University study of China's outbound investment, so outside of China, investments globally by the 2 largest development banks in China, so the 2 largest banks in the world. And what you'll see, the blue is that power investments in 2018 dropped by about 60% by those 2 banks, and then it dropped another 68% in 2019. Now, that's a pretty dramatic shift. So the biggest funder of coal in the world has cut that by 90% in the last 2 years. Now, you don't read about that because they're not cutting back on projects they committed to 5 years ago. They're just not refilling the pipeline. So the pipeline of new coal-fired power plant, to my way of thinking, is going to dramatically drop in the developing world over the next 2 to 5 years, because Japan, Korea and China aren't going to be funding it. And if you can't get government funding for a coal-fired power plant, you're certainly not going to get any private company to fund it. So the subsidised government financing that's been underpinning the Southeast Asian and the South Asia coal boom that our coal industry has been talking about is drying up rapidly. Now, there's factors in there. China's trying to protect its own domestic economy. Every country always puts their own economy first. China 2 years ago was trying to take over the world, trying to replace America. Now they're very much, thanks to the US-China trade war, focused on protecting their domestic economy. So for whatever reason, they've withdrawn all of their capital, all their finance, all their subsidised finance from coal plants globally. That's great news for the climate. Just throw a chart in about Australia. You're probably aware electricity demand's flatlined for a decade, so we've totally decoupled electricity demand from economic growth. That's a key achievement. That's a decade. So for a decade, electricity demand's gone nowhere in Australia. Economy's been strong up until this year. Coal's gone down dramatically, and wind and solar have replaced it all. So again, you'll hear about gas as the transition fuel. You've been hearing that rhetoric from the gas lobby groups and the Australian government. Sorry, they're probably interchangeable. For a decade, you're going to still hear about it for the next 5 or 10 years because the gas industry is phenomenally powerful in Australia. But the facts don't support the crap that they spin. Gas hasn't actually gone anywhere in Australia. In fact, it's been priced out of consideration because the gas industry has been gouging the Australian consumer. So every time you build a new solar project, you close a coal plant. We've closed 10 plants in the last decade. We're going to close another 10 coal plants. It's just a question of will we do it in 1 or 2 decades. So moving on to finance, there was a, to me, absolutely key announcement made in January of this year. I think it was a really important, globally significant landmark decision. Now, I'll contradict myself in a minute, but BlackRock's announcement. BlackRock announced in January 2020 that they were going to sell all of their thermal coal stocks. They held them all the way down, but now they're going to sell them after they've lost 90% of their value. And they'll do it by June of this year. So thermal coal, they don't believe in divestment, but they're divesting from coal. They also announced that they're joining Climate Action 100. They announced that they're doing the TCFD for every company they invest in. In other words, everything in the world, every corporate in the world. They're joining the SASB, the Global Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. They're going to mandate that for every company in the world by the end of this year. They're going to do quarterly proxy voting disclosures of their own actions. Now, they're the global laggard when it comes to actually voting on climate change. They've committed in writing, their CEO's committed, every quarter they're going to disclose their voting track record. And on every significant, globally significant vote, they will disclose it at real time. That's a pretty dramatic change. So a lot of people and a lot of the environmentalists say BlackRock's total hypocrite, BlackRock's not done anything, they don't mean it, they're going to walk back from it. I don't believe that at all. I read their statement and I see a huge number of commitments that the world's biggest equity fund manager has committed to as of January of this year. Now, I said I'll contradict myself. Larry Fink was in Australia last week, or the week before, and he spent most of that week talking up fossil fuels. Now, he was saying what our government wants to hear, what our industry wants to hear, and what he believes. So how do you then weigh those two statements? Now, a lot of environmentalists just say, well, he doesn't believe what he's committed to doing. I don't think he does. It's not a matter. He's already done it. He's announced he's going to do it, and I think they'll make major new steps within 12 months to solidify and go 5 steps beyond where they've gone. Now, how do you reconcile those two? In December of 2019, the Japanese pension plan, the biggest pension owner in the world, $1.5 trillion of pension money run by the Japanese government, took a $50 billion mandate off BlackRock. And they gave it to LGIM of the UK, which is one of the top sustainability fund managers in the world. And it was a very, very overt announcement. We're taking off BlackRock, the ESG laggard, and we're giving it to the ESG major. $50 billion. It's no coincidence that the next month Larry Fink makes a huge song and dance about ESG. So I believe BlackRock absolutely will do what they've said they'll do, and they'll move 5 or 10 steps further over the next couple of years. And it doesn't matter what Larry Fink believes, it's about what they will do to protect their franchise and grow their franchise. So it's not just about BlackRock. Now, BlackRock is the biggest equity manager in the world, is the biggest financial institution in the world. It's a $7 trillion giant. But 125 other globally significant financial institutions have likewise put in coal policy statements, almost all of them in the last 2 or 3 years. We've had 15 this year so far, and most of them are actually more detailed and more comprehensive policies on policies they initiated last year or the year before. So 126 of the world's most significant financial institutions now have formal coal, and by coal I'm talking thermal coal and coal-fired power plant, divestment policies, exclusion policies, restriction policies. Almost all of them talk about alignment with Paris. They're nowhere near aligned with Paris, but they've made the first hardest step. And so what we then find is that once they make a step, it's very easy to make the next step, because they immediately realise the first step is nowhere near aligned with Paris. The Paris Climate Agreement, 1.5 to 2 degrees. So they will tighten the ratchet it up quite aggressively, because they'll find it actually doesn't cost them anything. And in fact, as BlackRock's doing, they're just doing it for normal business circumstances. They can wash it in green to make them feel good, but the reality is banks and insurers are motivated by profitability. There's a list of some of the companies. Whitehaven and the AFR made a very big splash about how Whitehaven did $1 billion refinancing last month. So therefore this list can't be right. That's how the AFR wanted to pitch the story, because the AFR obviously panders to the fossil fuel industry, who are their advertisers. Whitehaven said, in the AFR article, you can read about it, says, oh, we moved from Asia being 20% of our funding to 50%. Now, I would argue that's because Asia is, at the moment, a laggard, and so that's the only place they could actually find people willing to bankroll one of Australia's largest thermal coal companies. So they had to move away from Australia because the Australian banks are increasingly unwilling to fund thermal coal. Now, it's nowhere near black and white, it's nowhere near comprehensive, but it's just getting worse by the month. And Whitehaven is one of the best coal operators in Australia in some of the metrics that I track. So if the best is having real trouble getting financing, the worst performers have no chance, and they openly now admit that. I try and look at what the financial markets are doing rather than just the theory or the moral question. Morality and finance don't really go very well together. But people like 350 talk about divestment and the moral requirement, the fact that we need a livable planet. That's a more non-moral issue. But what we're seeing is that all of the global majors are exiting thermal coal. That's pretty significant. Don't look at what I'm saying, don't look at what 350 says that they want to happen, look at what's actually happening. So Rio exited coal in 2018. They spent 5 years divesting every coal asset that they had. South 32 got rid of, and coal, thermal coal. They're still in coking coal for steel generation. BHP said they won't invest any new capital in thermal coal. They make 26 million tonnes a year of thermal coal. They said they won't invest to replenish that. They'll just run it down if they can't sell it. They'd love to sell it, but they can't find a buyer, is my reading of it. Anglo American has, again, likewise said that they want to exit thermal coal. The Japanese trading houses have almost uniformly exited thermal coal. Doesn't get much airtime, but all of those companies are major players, or sorry, were major players in the Australian thermal coal industry, and they've all exited quietly. Glencore. The CEO of Glencore loves coal. He produces 150 million tonnes a year of thermal coal, and he's going to retire in the next year or two. So he has said he will not commit the new CEO of Glencore to remaining in thermal coal, and the press has been speculating, because he's fueling the speculation, he's talking about spinning off the coal division. Now, I reckon it's because the Western finance won't invest in thermal coal. Ivan Glassenberg owns 9% of Glencore. When he retires, he'll be free to privatise the coal business. He'll spin it off, it'll be sold down on the theory of line putting, therefore it'll be cheap and therefore he'll buy it. That would be my guess as to what will happen. But so divestment is not a good idea in some respects. You actually want sterilisation of those assets. You want them run into the ground over the next 10 years. You want the communities and the workforces to have a chance to transition. That won't happen if you just sell it off to private equity. But nevertheless, capital is fleeing. The equity markets are fleeing, the debt markets are fleeing, the insurers are fleeing. And once you get through thermal coal and then coal-fired power plants, then you go, what's next? Now, it's not coking coal, which is what the Minerals Council and what the QRC keeps saying, we're going to go after coking coal next. No, you're going to go after Arctic drilling. You're going to go after deep sea oil drilling. You're going to go after fracking. You're going to go after the ones that aren't viable. The Saudis have just made all of them unviable overnight. Then you'll come back to coking coal, because ultimately there is no carbon budget for coal use absent carbon capture and storage, and we all know CCS is a fig leaf of the coal industry's imagination. It's PR spin. It doesn't work for coal cost effectively. Having to take a challenge on that. I am not a bear on carbon capture and storage, I'm a bear on the viability of coal to be competitive if you have to actually internalise the pollution externalities of coal against ever lower renewable energy. So Adani, I study India most of the time. I've spent a lot of time working on Adani. I'm going to give you a different version on Adani. Adani is technology agnostic. Adani is now probably the most powerful man in India. Adani put out a statement 2 months ago, Gautam Adani, the founder of the Adani Group, the most powerful man in India, and his statement was that he expects Adani to be the biggest renewable energy company, biggest solar company in India this year. They will be the biggest solar company in the world by 2025. They'll be the biggest renewable energy company in the world by 2030. Now, you probably all thought I was going to talk about Carmichael. I'm talking about where Adani's capital is going. Adani's capital is going into renewables. Now, why would he do that? Because he's a billionaire and he just wants to make himself more powerful and richer every day. Adani has made a huge amount of return on their renewable energy business. It's up 600%. The Indian market is flat. So Gautam Adani is a billionaire. He likes making money. He makes a lot of money in renewables. He can get leverage into the renewable energy business. Total just bought half of his existing renewable energy business in India for $500 billion, and they want to buy more renewable energy, and they want to do it through a politically connected person who likes making money. So they've partnered with Adani. Adani's raised $1 billion in the green bond and US debt markets in the last 6 months. In other words, global pension money wants to get access to India. They can't get through the closed financial system, so they're doing it through Adani Green. So Adani has almost unlimited access to capital for renewables in India, and he's being rewarded for it. So put aside Carmichael and look at what Adani is actually spending their money on, where they're making the most money. It's renewables. Now, Adani has also built in the last 5 years the second biggest grid transmission operation company in India. So India used to have a state-owned enterprise that dominated the grid, had 98% market share. The government of India wanted competition, so they invited in private competition. Gautam Adani grabbed it, and Adani Transmission was IPO'd 3-4 years ago. It is the best performing stock in the Indian market. It makes this one look pretty bad. It's up 1,000% in 5 years. Now, interestingly, alignment of interest is what Adani is very good at. They have halved the cost of grid transmission in India in this process because they took on a monopoly and they brought in competition. And the facts that we've seen suggest very, very strongly that they've halved the cost of grid transmission. Now, that's really strategically important for India because India is going to spend $200 billion upgrading their grid in the next decade. Now they have the money access to it because Adani and Adani Transmission is bringing it, as are a couple of other companies. But B, they're doing it at half the cost of what it would have cost the Indian people 2 years ago. So they're bringing capital and they're bringing lower cost, ever lower cost sources of supply. And so India, I find fascinating. India is the third largest economy in the world. It's the third largest electricity market in the world. They have committed to building 450 gigawatts of renewable by 2030. And it's the Prime Minister who talks about it every day. It's the coal minister who talks about it every day. It's the power and renewable, the new and renewable energy minister that talks about it every day. There is no conflict on that objective. It is 100% aligned with energy security needs of India. And the most powerful man in India is 100% aligned with it. Gautam Adani. Industry is moving very, very rapidly. So that's actually why I study India, because in Australia, the political landscape is toxic because our fossil fuel companies dominate our politicians, pay them or control them, whatever you want to call it. Whereas in India, the government is all about the interests of India, building energy security, using Indian natural resources. Now, they very clearly define coal in India as a natural resource. They also define hydro, wind and solar as their natural resources. It's all about using the Indian domestic resources to the maximum amount of their ability to solve their fossil fuel import problem. So that's probably enough for me. Do we have questions?
So that was very interesting and remarkable. I didn't expect to hear that about Adani at the end there.
I've thrown that one in just to please note I've worked against the Carmichael coal project. It's uneconomic, it's unbankable, it's totally unnecessary, it will destroy the planet, and unfortunately it's still got a 50-50 chance of going ahead, but for various multitude of reasons. There are reasons to look at Adani in a very different light. The Stop Adani campaign should be the Stop Carmichael campaign. Unfortunately, it targets the company, not the project.
Good. So with the slider, we've had 13 questions come in. So we'll go from the most popular down. So it says solar is cheap, but storage is expensive. So what's the total cost of supplying 24/7 from solar?
Yep. That's partly why I avoid the let's get to net zero by 2050 or zero, whatever you want to call it. Industry is phenomenally capable at solving any problem if the mandate is clear, the objective is clear, and they'll do it far faster than anyone thinks possible. But there is no one solution. So the idea that the world's energy market is going to be powered by solar in the next 2 decades, zero chance. It will be powered by a combination of factors. So it'll be powered by wind, solar, hydro. There will be some coal. There will be, because the reality is we're still building coal-fired power plants and they have a 40-year life. So we're going to be using coal somewhere in the world for the next 30 plus years, potentially 40 years. They are stranded assets. They will never get an acceptable rate of return on that investment without massive government subsidies. But they'll still be operating. You can operate a coal plant and still lose money. I'm just asked Tata Power. They built India's biggest coal-fired power plant. They lose money with every unit they produce. They've actually said to the Gujarat government just today that they're going to turn it off at the end of this month, that they're sick of losing money on India's biggest coal-fired power plant. They don't want to lose money every day.
How old was it? So how old was that?
Oh, it's only commissioned. It's 10 years old. They've lost money every single day they've operated it for 10 years. No, it's a diabolical mess. I talked to the CEO of Tata Power and they openly say they'll never build another coal-fired power plant ever again. They've been saying that for 2 or 3 years. Now, when you're losing on a $4 billion investment that the World Bank 10 years ago thought was the best thing since sliced bread, and now it's a stranded asset that's never covered its gross cash flow. Now, by the way, I'm talking gross, EBITDA, before depreciation, before interest, before generating a return. They did nothing. They lose money every single day they operate it, and the CEO just, look, I'm getting sick of losing money, I'm going to close the plant down. That's literally in the press this morning. I mean, he's been saying it for a couple of weeks now.
So BIS talked about what Commonwealth governments or Reserve banks having to possibly buy out stranded assets. Your thought on that?
Yeah, I follow Mark Carney very, very closely. I mean, he's been all over this for 5 years, the governor of the Bank of England, the chair of the Network for Greening of Financial Institutions, which sounds like a green NGO, but it's in fact 50 of the most powerful financial central institutions in the world. They're dedicated to trying to actually save the global financial system from $20 trillion. I mean, you mentioned a 4-degree world, so then you multiply it by, 10 times that amount. You threw out a number, who knows? I mean, it's the end of the world for 4 degrees, so we're not going to get there. We have to do something. So Mark Carney is dedicating his career to actually solving that problem and trying to avoid the stranded asset risks. But to me, the financial institutions are running very rapidly already. They're realising they're losing money, and so they're just trying to palm it off onto the governments. So I don't know if I just answered your question, but...
You did. Your thoughts on the National and their efforts to try and build a coal plant in Queensland?
Yes. Anyone heard of Shine Energy? Anyone read The Guardian 2 weeks ago?
Yeah.
So Shine Energy, 2 men and a dog. They don't even have an office, they've got a letterbox. So unfortunately that Guardian article, in my view, is spot on. It's farcical, and the government's response is, oh, we haven't given them $4 million of your money yet. That's Scott Morrison's reply. We haven't handed the $4 million that we're giving 2 men and a dog who've never operated a single project in their life. Now, I say that a bit disparagingly. I know the guys involved and they're lovely individuals, but if the Nats want to give them $4 million, they're happy to take $4 million of your money. It's that stupid, but that's what the National Liberal Party is proposing. So this is Matt Canavan, Senator Canavan, this is George Christensen's proposal to subsidise. Now, it's very serious. It's more serious than I would have given it credit for a while back. I mean, at the end of the day, it's also maybe related to Adani, but they want to try and build major dams around central Queensland. Now, I was talking to a proposer of a new dam in New South Wales last week, and he's saying his biggest problem is he's trying to do it in Barnaby Joyce's electorate, and Barnaby wants to build a whole new dam because that'll cost 5 times as much, and that'll bring investments to Tamworth. It'll cost 5 times as much as the proposal that's before the Tamworth government, or Tamworth City Council, to double the water supply of Tamworth, a country town on massive level 4 water restrictions. But Barnaby's got a solution that costs 4, 5, 10 times as much. That's a far better solution. So, I'm being very disparaging of the National Party, but at the end of the day, they're all about big projects in remote regional Australia that we don't need, haven't done any feasibility, no viability, no bank's going to touch them without massive government subsidy. No utility wants to go near them. So a lot of sarcasm there, but it's a risk that our government's talking about building a coal-fired power plant, a $2 billion coal-fired power plant that every CEO of every utility in Australia says they won't touch with a barge pole. All the banks have said they won't touch it with a barge pole. So who thinks it's a good idea? Barnaby.
Global demand for Australian coal in 5 to 10 years' time and the impact on royalties?
Yeah. So let's unpack that question. There's 2 types of coal. Australia is the world's biggest exporter of thermal coal.
So thermal.
Coking coal? Okay, so Queensland, though, produces coking coal. 80% by value of Queensland's coal exports are coking coal. So coking coal at the moment is not technologically challenged at the moment. There is no alternative. If we want to use steel, virgin steel, you need coking coal. Now, big caveat there, you can use recycled steel. China at the moment doesn't use recycled steel because they're still expanding their steel stocks. So they will move. But to get back to thermal coal, which is New South Wales' key problem, because New South Wales individually is the state exports the most thermal coal in Australia and globally. My forecast is it's going to 0 by 2050. Now, that's a pretty conservative estimate. It could easily get there 10 or 15 years earlier. But say it gets to zero by 2050, that's a 3% annual reduction every year from now on. It'll probably be a lot faster than that, and the profitability of the industry will disappear, but probably has already this year. But BHP's losing money at the gross cash flow level on Mount Arthur, the biggest mine in New South Wales already. So going to zero screws the community and the workforce. It screws the New South Wales government because they get $3 or $4 billion of royalties a year, but the profitability will disappear well before then. So it'll happen probably in 15, 20 years time. But that's zero for thermal coal. So why are we building the Galilee, which is 100% low quality thermal coal? To flood the market with a product that's got a use by date of, if you're conservative, 30 years, if you're optimistic, it's 15. It's just ludicrous.
Japanese building new coal.
Yeah, I'd refer you to an op-ed my colleague Simon Nicholas put out last week on this, because it comes up in Canberra all the time. So I was talking to the Shadow Energy Minister about it, and he asked me that exact same question 2 weeks ago. That's what they get every single day, 10 times a day. It's totally fact-free, but that's what they get. Japan's building 26 new coal-fired power plants. Okay, no, the facts are that Japan has 18 coal units under development. Now, coal plant, easy slip of the tongue, is what coal industry talks about. But we're not talking about plants, we're talking about individual units. A plant could have up to 6 units in it. Right? So they're proposing 18 new units. What the coal industry and coal lobbyists forget to mention is that Japan plans to close 19 units in the next 5 years, 2025. Now, all of this information is publicly available. It's at the Global Energy Monitor. They identify every single unit in the world in the coal sector above 30 megawatts, in other words, 99.5% of the market, and they track every individual unit. They track who owns it, who built it, what its life is, whether it's subcritical, every aspect about it. One of the obvious points that they track is that a coal plant doesn't operate after 40 or 45 years. What's the average closure rate in Australia? It's about 40 years. So Matt Canavan always says it's 50 years, but it's fact-free PR spin. So the average is 40 years. So where he pulls 50 out, you can guess. So if you look at Japan having a 40-year life, then they're going to close 19 units. So in fact, they're replacing new for old, if they build them all. But what they have been doing is pushing out, pushing out the construction timetable. They've been converting them to LNG. Now, you might be aware LNG prices in Japan have dropped 85% in the last 5 years. Coal's only down 50%, so LNG is a fraction of the price of what it used to be. So when they were happily designing these coal plants that we're talking about, coal units, they were all proposed 5 to 10 years ago. So they've been carefully monitoring the situation. They've been pushing out the construction timetables. They've converted a number of them to biomass, and they've converted a number of them to gas or LNG, because they import all their gas. And they're going to build a lot of offshore wind as well. So they're moving as fast as they possibly can into floating offshore wind. Now, the trouble is it's still 5 years away from commercial reality. But so our forecast is Japan will exit their last coal-fired power plant in 2050, but the industry is in terminal decline, because if you don't build one, you're going to close a unit every couple of months. And that's a point. So always think of, when you hear about coal plant additions, think about net additions or net closures, because we're actually in net closures globally.
Facts are good. There's a question here about utility solar PV. So the costs have fallen, also the returns are falling, and they get negative prices sometimes. Do you think that solar will slow?
Okay, a fact, I'll probably get the number wrong, but I think Australia installed 218 megawatts of rooftop solar last month alone. Right, that's the highest ever. Annualise that, that's 2.5 gigawatts of rooftop solar this year, if we maintain that. Now, what did we do last year? 1.95 gigawatts. Did anyone forecast that 5 years ago? No. The average system being installed in Australia, I believe, is now 6, 7, 8 kilowatts. 5-10 years ago, we were doing 1 kilowatts and then we're doing 2 kilowatts. So the systems have doubled and doubled again in size. Batteries are still 2 or 3 years away from commercial viability, but there are plenty of early adopters, there are plenty of people pissed at the government, there are plenty of people who want to go off grid. So batteries are going to transform the industry as well. Now that's all rooftop solar, but the highest ever rooftop solar in Australia. Solar utilities require a grid, and they require a grid that can balance them, a grid fit for purpose. Now, for a decade we gold-plated our grid for a massive expansion of capacity. For the last 5 years we've turned that CapEx tap off because we spend probably $10 billion on a grid that's not fit for purpose. So now we need to return that tap on and make the grid modern and fit for purpose. Until we do that, we're going to have a lot of intermittency, we're going to have a lot of disruptions, we're going to have a lot of MLF reductions, we're going to get investors burnt, we're going to have chaos in the energy market. That's exactly what 7 years of the current government's policy has created. So are we going to have a reduction in the amount of new solar going in? Yes. On grid utility scale, yes. Is it the low cost source of new supply? Yes. Do we need to firm it? Yes. Do we need batteries? Do we need pumped hydro storage? Do we need more grid connectivity? Yes. AEMO's got an ISP, the Integrated System Plan. It's a brilliant document. It's far better than any other document because we haven't got any other document. So plenty of ways you can throw rocks at AEMO. I love them. I think that they have a 10-year plan. They're thinking about it. They're modelling it. They're doing scenario analysis, but they've created a plan. You can't invest in billions of dollars every year in energy without a plan. So they could be better. We could have a climate objective for AEMO. We don't. So they're doing it without the most important factor in their planning, but nevertheless they're working on the integration of renewables. They're working on South Australia to New South Wales integrated connectivity. They're working on Victoria to New South Wales, Queensland to New South Wales. That'll open up a whole lot of renewable energy sectors. That will allow sensible investment where the grid can actually manage to incorporate it. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wait for 5 years for all of that to be turned on before you build a lot more utility scale solar and wind.
Your thoughts on the carbon border adjustment mechanism? When and how big and impacts and so on?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, everyone goes, oh, carbon taxes in Australia are toxic, we'll never go back to it. So let's go and, oh, that's right, what's our federal policy? The ERF, we're just going to subsidise carbon emission reductions, but we're not going to charge the polluters, we're just going to subsidise and
so the Europeans putting the price on them,
yeah.
impacting trade and stuff.
Yeah, so Europe has started to threaten that they will put a border tax on carbon. If Australia wants to be a laggard, our industry will suffer as a result of it, our economy will suffer as a result, but it's not just Europe. The biggest tax on coal use in the world is actually Korea. I mention that because they're our third largest exporter destination for our coal, coking and thermal. They have a $40 a tonne coal tax and a $20 a tonne ETS. It's not perfect, but it's certainly pretty good. So all of a sudden, think about Europe, the question I know that Lee's asking, just think, what if Korea joined with them? What if India joined with them?
What if China?
What if China joined them? What if in 10 years' time Australia is a global prior because we're so busy exporting all of our fossil fuels that we've ignored the future opportunities? It's going to happen one way or the other.
Will that have any impact on the WTO rules?
Yeah, Europe's debating how they introduce a carbon border tax in a way that doesn't, that circumvents the WTO rules on restraint of trade, but the WTO is not there to actually allow people to pollute, it's there to actually allow a level playing field. So will Europe find a way around it? Yep. How will they do it? I don't know, I'm not a lawyer.
So how long would you say in the next 5 years, earlier or later, next 10 years?
Yeah, I probably wouldn't expect it for 5 years. They'll talk about it for 5 years, they'll stuff around, the bureaucrats, their politicians, they'll never do anything quickly, but they do have to protect their own industry. And so the own industry is now 100% supportive, or 80%, 90% supportive. So maybe 5 years, but if you're building a coal-fired power plant, you're planning out 40 years. It's irrelevant whether it happens today or in 5 years' time. Either way, you're screwed. So banks just won't finance them. That's the end game.
How good is Australia's climate policy?
I think I've made my views very clear. It's farcical. It's totally the destruction of our democracy is what I would view it as. It's self-serving of the incumbent industry. It's a bit, when I was looking at IEEFA's game plan, we have offices in America and Europe and Hong Kong and Philippines, India, Australia. We also do Indonesia, and I've always said, why do we do Indonesia? Australia and Indonesia are the two most likely laggards in the world. Now, Japan's been a major laggard as well, for various reasons, but they import 98% of their energy, but that doesn't mean they have to be a climate laggard. Fukushima is the obvious answer. They had a low carbon strategy, it went up in smoke with Fukushima, and so now they're just desperate to do anything. But Indonesia is the world's biggest exporter of thermal coal. Australia, the second biggest exporter. We are the two big laggards. But Indonesia's still moving. Widodo, the president of Indonesia, has talked about a decarbonisation strategy for Indonesia. He's talked about moving his entire capital of 20 million people to a new location because it's sinking. Air pollution is an issue in Indonesia. Transition is an industry. At the moment, they're not doing much on renewables, so talk's easy, but it's also hollow. But Australia's carbon policy, I think the sooner well, put it in a positive. We have a net zero emissions target for every state or territory in Australia, don't we? So I've spent a lot of time lambasting the federal government. They have no plan, they have no policy. All they do is delay, deny, and defer the problem. But the reality is all the states are having to show leadership, and they aren't moving for good. It's not orchestrated, it's not clever to do a state-by-state plan for a national problem.
We might take one or two questions from the floor if I haven't covered the questions.
Hydrogen versus LNG. I mean, hydrogen any colour. I don't follow the pricing. How does it look, say, at the Japanese import terminal? How does that?
Yeah. Okay, I do care about the colour because the idea that grey hydrogen is a viable climate solution is a furphy. Grey is from fossil fuels. Blue hydrogen is if you do carbon abatement on gas. Now, how much carbon abatement on gas is done anywhere in the world? Close to zero. So blue hydrogen is a PR marketing spin by a very powerful gas industry that, oh, by the way, is getting weaker by the day. So blue hydrogen, they'll argue transition. We'll do blue hydrogen. Dr. Finkel talks about blue hydrogen equally because who's he employed by? The Liberal National Party. So he's got to talk hydrogen. He tries to ignore the colour. He pretends that blue hydrogen is a pathway to green hydrogen. But it is a pretense. If we're investing in blue hydrogen, if the rest of the world's racing towards blue hydrogen, and we're going to go, green hydrogen, bad slip of the tongue, we're going to go and stuff around with lignite to hydrogen? Wow, let's go. We're not talking grey or blue, we're talking about filthy hydrogen. That's where Australia wants to spend $500 million. That's crap. And then, Senator Canavan says, but the Japanese are in there with us. No, they're not. They're in there for, no, they're actually in there for blue, but there is no blue hydrogen because there's no carbon capture and storage associated with the lignite project down in Victoria. So they said they will come in for blue hydrogen. They're not going to fund grey. The Australian government's funding the grey, and the Japanese are waiting for it to be notionally blue. The Japanese are interested in developing a hydrogen economy. They've been talking about it for 40 years. They're desperate for it, but they're desperate for any energy solution. They do want to be a global, leader. They want to stop being a global laggard. Watch very carefully the environment minister of Japan. Now, normally I'd say ignore the environment minister of any country. Right? Who's the least important minister in any portfolio, any government anywhere in the world? The environment minister. But the environment minister in Japan is slightly different because he's also the son of a former prime minister and is the one of two candidates to be the next prime minister of Japan. And he's trying to make a name for himself. And so he is talking green hydrogen. He is talking deep decarbonisation. He's talking about making Japan a global leader again. Unfortunately, I think the second most powerful man in Japan, so Prime Minister Abe is 100% on side. He wants to decarbonise. He wants Japan to be a leader. I believe the second guy who's competing with the Environment Minister is very much directing Japan towards carbon capture and storage and Healy coal-fired power plants. You know, there's technology. If we make coal slightly cleaner, then people will still buy our crap. But I don't obviously buy that argument. So it's a long-winded. So to me, green hydrogen is going to be key, but I don't care whether it's green hydrogen or whether it's ammonia from renewables or any. GE talks about power to X, where X is any chemical. It could be aluminium, it could be ammonia, it could be hydrogen. You could export aluminium. Aluminium is just molten electricity. I probably got that phrase wrong, but the amount of electricity in aluminium is enormous. So is aluminium the way you actually export there? I don't know. I'm not the engineer. There are a million different solutions. And when I talk batteries, and we've got red flow, there are plenty of different battery technologies. Who knows which battery technology? Now, what I bet is that lithium-ion will play a key role because you've got Tesla and you've got the Chinese investing billions of dollars in it every year. But there will be other alternatives. I spent 2 hours last week talking to GE in Saudi Arabia about their cranes, like literally 250-ton blocks of cement on cranes, and they say that's the best technology they've come up with. Anyway, who knows? There are all sorts of different, so you literally just have a crane with 10 blocks of cement. It's bizarre, but anyway, it's just basic gravity. It works. It's maybe a lot less technical than a battery, but that's good actually in some respects. So there will be all sorts of different technologies, but I do think the chemical side of the equation is going to play a key role. And if I had to guess, and I'm not an engineer, I'm not a scientist, but the idea that you, probably going too far, it's, you could use hydrogen in the gas grid. You could pump 10 or 15% into it. Now, there are complications, there are issues, there are standards, it requires the government to be involved to endorse it, but every country in the world, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Chinese, the Germans, Queensland government, are all looking at hydrogen, green hydrogen.
Very good. With that, all right, yeah, go.
Second question.
Last one.
Aside from a carbon tax or an ETS, which may be politically difficult, what other sort of policy option or mechanism would you suggest for our energy sector to push it in the right direction, so to say?
Someone yesterday asked me the question from Queensland fossil fuel industry saying, is it too late for an ETS or for a carbon tax? Is it irrelevant? Have prices and technologies moved so far that it's going to happen now anyway that you don't even need a price on carbon? And if solar is $18 or $16 or $20 a megawatt hour, then like in India it's $30 a megawatt hour, but it's going to get 10 or 15% cheaper every year. So when I talk to the big players, they don't need a carbon tax anymore to drive it. It's just going to happen anyway. A carbon tax would be a bonus. It's a way of stopping an industry that is built on subsidies and externalising all of the costs and internalising all the profits. It's a way of rectifying that quickly, but is it necessary? I think it'd be a lot more equitable. It'd be a lot easier for heavy industry. But the power, you asked specifically about power, it's not needed. I mean, solar at $20 or $30, wind at $20 or $30, coal is the expensive option. That's what the Indians are saying, that's what the Mexicans are saying, that's what the Brazilians and the Chileans and the Qataris are saying. That's what Australia says. That's before a carbon tax in any of those markets. So with 10% annual deflation, who cares on a 10-year view? Now, I care about the environment, I care about the planet. I want it to happen faster. The scientists are telling it has to happen faster, but it's going to happen anyway. And so I just look at finance and go, well, finance might be slow, but they're not stupid. They're not going to piss money up against the wall continually on stranded assets. They'll just turn the tap off.
Makes sense when you put that up.
But a carbon tax would make it a lot easier, a lot faster, a lot more equitable, and accelerate the opportunities that are going to happen anyway, to accelerate what Dr. Finkel talks about every day.
And on that answer, I think we'll draw the evening to a close. Please thank Tim.